Well, folks, welcome to A Blast from the Past with this repost of ALF episode 121, in which we talked about Murray River yellowbelly fishing with gun angler Stephen Booth. Now, Boothie is a very, very accomplished angler who has done a lot of this style of fishing, and he explains that fishing the Murray for yellowbelly is a year-round option. They'll eat a lure summer, winter, spring, and autumn, but just be careful below the Yarrawonga Weir. There is a closed season for all species. So if the cod season's closed, you can't fish for yellows there either. Other than that, they're a year-round option. You just need to know a few tricks to be able to go out and catch yellowbelly on lures from the flowing water all year round. Now, I have to say, this has been one of the most popular and most downloaded episodes of the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast ever. So if you haven't heard this episode before, there's a good chance that you might have missed some of the other episodes that also have tons and tons of great information. So go and check it all out at doclures.com. Just type yellowbelly into the search bar or golden perch. That'll bring up all the previous episodes and you'll be able to go through and find tons more great information on targeting this amazing species. Now, the other way you can get tons of great information, of course, is to join Team Doc Lures and support the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast, because there's some members-only podcast editions over in the Team Doc Lures site, along with audio masterclasses, tackle deals, online resources, a whole bunch of stuff there to help you catch more fish on lures. So go and check that out, team.doclures.com. That's team.doclures.com. Join up today, get access to all that great stuff, and watch your fishing improve. But now, folks, let's hit that Murray River and let's chase those yellowbelly on lures with gun angler Stephen Booth.
This is the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast, where we share the secrets of Australia's lure fishing gurus every Monday, Wednesday and Friday. And now here's your host, Greg Vinal from doclures.com.
Folks, welcome to another episode of the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast. I'm Greg Vinal, and my job, of course, is to bring you Australia's best and brightest lure fishers and get them to share a few secrets about how to catch fish on lures just as well as they do. Today, we are going to be talking about yellowbelly in the flowing parts of the Murray River system. We're going to focus on that area 100 k's upstream and 100 k's downstream of Yarrawonga Weir. There is some amazing yellowbelly fishing to be had there. To help us along the way, I'm pleased to announce that Stephen Booth is joining us once again. Now, Boothie's been on the show previously. He rocked the microphone talking about Murray cod in Lake Mulwala, and he is going to rival that episode with what he tells us in this episode. G'day, Stephen. Welcome back to Australian Lure Fishing, mate.
Yeah, g'day, Greg. Great to be back.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk yellows tonight, and a lot of people like their yellow fishing. You've done a fair bit of it, so it should be a pretty good episode. And we're going to focus on river yellows in the Murray. What stretch of Murray are we going to look at here? It's a pretty long river.
Yeah, it is a pretty long river. Let's say, well, we'll concentrate around the Mulwala area, say 100 k's upstream, 100 k's downstream of Mulwala. It's all pretty similar water.
Sounds great, mate. Now, look, we've already had this sort of introductory stuff. You've been on the show before, so folks, if you don't know who Stephen is and you want to find out a bit more, go and check out his previous episode where we talked about Mulwala cod fishing, and he absolutely rocked the microphone for that episode. It's been a very, very popular download. You can find out a little bit about what makes Stephen tick, but today we're going to skip over all that stuff and start talking about yellows generally. So river fishing for yellows is a little bit different from impoundment fishing. Would you like to give us a bit of a hint as to why that might be, mate?
Yeah, well, basically it's current. I think that's the main difference. I've recently started doing a whole bunch of impoundment fishing for yellows and really taken by it, but my heritage is fishing in the flowing water for the yellows, and the fish are a little bit more aggressive, certainly much more lean than they are in the lakes and impoundments. And they hit really, really hard and fight really, really well.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the things with impoundments is they tend to have plenty of tucker in them, and so fish can become a little bit lazy, they can become a little bit choosy. But I think in the rivers quite often they've got to work a bit harder for a feed, they've got to take what they can get, so they tend to be a bit more aggressive. And I'm not talking just yellows here, I think that's the same for quite a lot of different species, has been my experience. So, mate, tell us something that you've discovered since you've been fishing for yellows that might be news to the average angler who hasn't done a lot of yellow fishing.
Yeah, okay. In the rivers, I would say that the one thing I notice the most is that the biggest and best-looking snags aren't necessarily the best snags for yellows fishing.
Ooh, that's a juicy tip, mate. So where do you find them then? What's the trick? If it's not the biggest, juiciest snag, what is it?
Yeah, so a lot of the time if I'm going down a river, I'm not necessarily missing the big snags, but I'm not fishing in the best hidey holes. I reckon the cod take up those and the yellows are pushed to the outside of the snag. So all those fine tendrils and the smaller branches and definitely the older trees with finer branches rather than leaves and stuff on them that have just fallen is where I tend to look in the current.
So, mate, what are the primary food items for river yellowbelly?
Most of the yellows we catch, when we used to keep them and eat them, had shrimp and yabbies most of the time. There was the occasional one had a bait fish, but not a lot of that. Most of it was crustaceans.
So let's just imagine in our mind's eye that stretch of river. So we've got a 200-kilometre long stretch. So, as I said at the start, the Murray, it's a pretty big river, but 200 kilometres, it narrows it down a fair bit, but that's still a lot of water. So if I was heading for that part of the world, intent on getting into a yellowbelly, where would I start looking for fish, mate? What would your advice be regarding finding fish? Are we land-based fishing? Are we boat fishing? How do we go about finding them?
Yeah, I tend to do a bit of both. Probably my favourite stretch is the stretch immediately below Yarrawonga Weir, or that's Lake Mulwala, for those who don't know. So the 50 kilometres straight down from the Weir wall there is fantastic golden perch fishery. There's probably a couple of reasons for that. It's closed off to all fishing for 3 months of the year, down to below Token Wall, I think. So it gets no pressure during the Murray cod close season. And also the yellowbelly basically run upstream to spawn and get stuck at the Yarrawonga Weir wall if they don't go through the fish lift there. So the fish move up into that area and there's a lot of them there.
So it's a little bit of an unfair advantage insofar as we know that there's going to be an accumulation of fish there. So what are the migratory patterns of these fish, mate? So you can't fish during the close season for cod, which is as we speak, but what time of year do they move up, start doing their migratory move and get caught up below the wall there?
Yeah, so they're doing that at the same time as the cod do that. So they have eggs that float, so they need to migrate upstream so that when the eggs are released and fertilised, they've actually got time to float down and find the right area in which to hatch and for the babies to have a nice lot of food. So that's why they undertake their migration upstream. And so I think some of them have been recorded up to 2,500 kilometre swims, which is a fairly big effort for a fish to swim 2.5 kilometres upstream just to spawn. It's not such a good spot to go to in the close season below Yarrawonga Weir right now because it's totally closed to all fishing. But if you go above Lake Mulwala, say from Bundalong upstream, all the fish, all the yellowbelly that were in Lake Mulwala have moved up into the rivers and they'll be looking to spawn up in the rivers there.
Right, so is it pretty much a year-round fishery? I mean, obviously as the water warms up, yellowbelly tend to get a little bit more active and while they're migrating, they tend to be a bit more hungry as well. But if we were to fish there during the winter or during the autumn, is it still good fishing for yellowbelly in that part of the river?
Yeah, it definitely is good fishing for yellowbelly at any time of the year. You can access it. The only problem with winter is that you'll be fishing with smaller lures for yellowbelly and a big cod will jump on, or you'll hook a yellowbelly and a big angry greenfish will come up and eat your yellowbelly, which is not much fun for the yellowbelly, I'd imagine.
But it's pretty good fun for the angler, though, so that's a pretty good problem to have, is you're either getting your lures nailed by a big green fish or you're getting your yellowbelly nailed by a big green fish, and even if you don't land it, that's still a pretty amazing experience. So if we were to look at this as a 12-month proposition, so set aside that area below Yarrawonga Weir where there's a few months of the year where you can't fish, but the rest of the system, if you were to start, say, at the current time, so spring, and go through the summer, autumn, winter, and back through spring again, how does the fishing change? Do you need to change your approach much during those different times of the year?
Yeah, I tend to. I think at this time of year, the fish will all school up because they are trying to spawn. So a little bit better with things like lipless crankbaits. As it comes into summer and fish start moving back down the river, it's really, really good hard body lure fishing time. And as you get into the cooler months, I tend to stick with spinnerbaits and hard bodies. So yeah, there is a bit of a pattern. My favourite time of all is just after summer when the fish are really aggressive and you're throwing hard bodies and you're actually retrieving them quite vigorously and they hit it so hard. So that's my absolute pinnacle time.
Yeah, cool. So, mate, we'll focus on the coming months, so that spring period and early summer and into the summer months. So if we were to head up there at this time of year, what would you say constitutes the perfect conditions for fishing for yellowbelly? And you've already mentioned flow, so we might actually circle back to that a bit later on. But in terms of barometric pressure, in terms of weather conditions and that sort of thing. What's sort of perfect yellowbelly fishing?
Yeah, perfect yellowbelly fishing actually is coming up right now, where you get those days that are getting a bit longer, a little bit warmer, a nice calm day, so you're not fighting the elements. And I'm looking for days that basically revolve around the moon cycles. Now, I'm not real over the top of the moons, but definitely the new moons and the full moons have an impact on your fishing.
And this is a little bit of a left field question, I know, but in a lot of places, when we talk to the barra fishermen, for example, they'll say, it doesn't matter that you're fishing a landlocked impoundment. Usually the peak times for barra fishing coincide with the tide changes down at the coast. Is that the same thing in the freshwater systems for yellowbelly?
Oh, not that I've recognised myself. Someone who keeps tabs on the tides while they're fishing 2,100 kilometres from the ocean might have a better idea than me. But in all honesty, I haven't really paid much attention to the tides. I've paid a lot of attention to moon up, moon down, moon above, and moon below, which is loosely associated with the tides. And there are those, certainly the solunar bite periods people talk about. I think that matters quite a bit.
Yeah, okay. What about time of day, mate? Are these an all-day proposition, or do you have sort of peak periods and that low light like a lot of species?
Yeah, like a lot of species, we call the last hour of any day the golden hour. So even if we're fishing for cod for the last hour of the day, if we don't want to fish surface cod, we'll concentrate on yellowbelly fishing. They tend to really fire up in the rivers right as that light hits the horizon and just has that hour of daylight savings time before it gets dark.
It seems to be the same for so many species. But at least there's a couple of periods in the day when you can expect the fishing's going to be pretty good.
Absolutely.
Mate, let's go back now and talk about flow, because it's a really, really big factor when it comes to fishing any freshwater flowing system, whether it's high, whether it's low, flowing fast, flowing slow, cold, hot, all that kind of stuff affects how the fish behave. In the Murray system, of course, quite often you'll have the highest flows during the summer period when the irrigators need water and so water's being released for agriculture, which is at odds with what would have been the natural flow regime. And, of course, in the winter time when naturally there would have been a lot of flow, in the winter spring when there would have been snow melt from up in the Alps as well, you often get quite low flows. So how do you work the flows to find and catch yellowbelly in that part of the river?
Yeah, so when I'm looking at that, I'll pay very close attention. There's a great website from Golden Murray Water, which has all the flow rates coming out of Lake Hume, and it's got dot points along the whole river telling you what the flow is along that. So I look for little increases in the flow. That certainly is a trigger for the fish to do that migration and move upstream and get a bit active. So look for little peaks. If you can look at a spot, say, that's 50 or 100 kilometres upstream from where you're fishing, the next day or two you're going to have a little rise go through where you're fishing. So you can loosely time it if you've got enough time. Most of the time, most of us are just going fishing when we can. So we deal with conditions as we find it. But if you can time it on that little rise, you're probably going to have better fishing.
Yeah. And that little rise can have nothing to do whatsoever with rainfall in that system, of course, because a lot of the rain's being trapped. The majority of the flow is coming from releases from Hume or Dartmouth Dam, I guess. Yeah. All right, so let's imagine we've hit the river system. We're there at the start of the day. We're going to catch that first light. We're looking for those snags that are probably not inhabited by cod, so some of those lesser snags, the smaller snags, the tendrils and the smaller branches that you've talked about. So tell us exactly how the day would unfold if we were on the boat with you, mate. What would your strategy be from the time the boat hits the water until you sort of pull it out of the water at the end of the day?
Yep, so I'm probably starting off with a lipless crankbait. That's a really, really good searching tool. We use a number of different ones, but mostly we'll use the jackals like just about everybody else in the world. And with that, we're searching areas. So I'll still be looking to cover a snag thoroughly before I'm happy to move on. These days, with the modern sounders, we can actually see the fish a little bit better in the snags, and especially on the edges. So with that, we know there are fish there, and we'll throw a couple of varieties of lures at them. As I said, starting with lipless crankbait, that doesn't work. We might get out a deep diving minnow and work that through the snag just to make sure that the fish are there and active or not.
Yeah, so I've noticed with the freshwater fishermen that quite often there's kind of two approaches. There are those that say, I'm going to cover as much water as I can until I find the active and aggressive fish. So I'm going to pepper each snag with half a dozen casts. and then I'm going to move on. And then there's the camp that says, well, if you found a good snag, if you found a likely place where fish might be, or you can see them on your sounder, then stay there and keep throwing lures at them. And it's kind of like poking the bear until the bear gets angry enough to bite. So which of those two camps are you in, mate?
So if I'm cod fishing, I'm definitely a run and gun. I'm 3 casts at each snag and looking for the active one. If I'm golden perch fishing, I'm definitely having a minimum of 20 casts at each snag. And those 20 casts will vary from a stock standard chuck it out and just wind it in with a slow roll, all the way through to crawling a lipless crankbait along the bottom or ultra slow retrieving a hard bodied lure. I think the speed of retrieve in these river yellowbellies certainly makes a big, big difference.
So talk us through how you figure out what speed to retrieve, mate. Is there kind of a process that you go through where you have some favourite retrieves you try and circle through them, or how do you sort of figure out what's working on the day?
Yeah, it's basically cycling through them until we find a pattern. And one of my good mates that I fish a lot with, Mark Ainsworth, came across the ultra-slow retrieve quite by accident. And when he was just a bit bored one day and slowed everything right down and just blitzed it that afternoon. It was a little bit embarrassing for me to be on a boat watching him do it. But so that's one of our prime tactics. Every time I come down from Queensland to go fishing with him, his first half of the day is telling me to slow down to make sure I'm retrieving at the right pace. If that straight slow retrieve doesn't work, I like to put little hops in the rod, I call it. So I'll be retrieving at a constant speed, but just bouncing the rod tip just gently like a wave. So the lure will speed up for maybe a foot and then slow down for a foot and then speed up for a foot and slow down for a foot. So it just introduces a little bit of variety. And then the last retrieve I suppose we do is one that's keeping the lure in the fish's face. So we use a suspending lure. We used to use the deception nippers and shrimps quite a bit, and it's hard to find suspending lures these days. And you basically jerk it a bit more tropical barramundi / jack type retrieve, where you'll work the lure hard and let it sit, and then work the lure hard and then let it sit. And in the current, you can actually sit that lure, if you're careful with it, in front of those little tendrils and work it right around it in the one retrieve. And if you need to free spool it to let it drop back into the snag, you can do that and make a retrieve last for a couple of minutes if you need it to. So, yeah, just keeping those options open and trying all of it until we see what the fish are up to.
Yeah, right, mate. Now, one of the things that immediately jumps out at me is if you think about lipless crankbaits, they don't have a reputation for being the most snag-proof of lures, and you're working them through a fair bit of structure. Likewise, suspending jerkbaits, they have a tendency to get a bit hooked up as well. So what's your strategy for getting in amongst those fish without getting hung up every few seconds?
Yeah, with the lipless crankbait, I was taught very early on from one of the guns, Roger Miles, who's a guide on Lake Mulwala. He's just given up, unfortunately, but he used to guide there, was to hold the rod at a 45-degree angle up, and it just angles the lipless crankbait on its retrieve just enough so you can hit both snags, and the lure actually will bounce over it rather than have the lure swim flat. It tends to swim a bit more nose down with that 45-degree angle.
Yep.
You can work it through fairly thick country. I'm not going to say a lipless crankbait is anything but a snaggy lure, because they are, but you can manage it somewhat with that 45-degree rod angle as you're retrieving. Rather than, people point the rod tip at the water, you're actually pointing it 45 degrees up off the horizontal. So that's a really, really good tip. And his other tip for me early on was retrieve that noisy lipless crankbait, so a Jackal TN60, for example, so that the rattles aren't rattling. That's how slow he wants to retrieve it. So it allows you to walk it through some really mean country. With the suspending hard bodies, it's just bad luck. You're going to get snagged. So I have worked out a real good way to work those anyway without getting snagged, but they work so well that you just put up with it.
Yeah. Buy yourself a good lure retriever. What do you use to retrieve your lures, mate?
Yeah, I'm a push pole guy. If I get it with a push pole and it's too deep, then I'm in a whole world of trouble. So I've still got a tackle retriever on a cord, which I use. But yeah, push pole is my favourite item for that.
Yeah, good stuff. All right, mate, let's switch over now and talk about rods, reels, lines and leaders. So walk us through the selection of tackle that you're going to take with you on a yellowbelly sortie.
Yep, so let's start with my favourite outfit, which is a Bone Drago 610. So it's a 6'10" rod. It's a 10 to 20 pound rated rod. So in the old school, probably 4 to 6 kilo rod. But with all the modern materials, it's quite light and easy to use. So to that, I've just got a 100 size bait caster attached to it. In the warmer months, I'll fish 10 pound braid with a 15-pound leader. In the cooler months, I'll bump up to 20-pound braid with 20-pound leader. That's basically the outfit. If I'm just yellowbelly fishing, that's what I'm using in the rivers. So that's a bait casting outfit.
Okay, so that covers all eventualities or lures. Now, with your leaders, mate, do you have a preference for fluorocarbon or nylon, and what length of leader do you fish?
It depends what lures I'm using. My preference always is first to go to fluorocarbon. In my head, I think it makes a difference. However, if I'm using a suspending lure, I'm probably more likely to want to use a mono leader. Mono leaders don't sink quite as fast or float, depending on what their construction is, as the fluorocarbon. So the mono leader helps with that snagging of the suspending lure. On a diving minnow, I'll just use fluorocarbon, lipless crankbait. I actually want the sink rate of the fluorocarbon, so I'll use fluorocarbon for that too.
Excellent stuff, mate. Look, we're going to move on in just a moment and go through some of those lures in a little bit more detail. You've already given us pretty broad clues. Well, you haven't given us clues. You've actually named a couple of lures that you use for the yellows. So we're going to flesh those out a little bit more in just a moment. But before we do that, let's go off and thank our sponsors. Folks, we are fishing the Murray River 100 kilometres upstream to 100 kilometres downstream of Yarrawonga Weir. And with us is Stephen Booth from Wilson Fishing Australia, and he is sharing with us a whole bunch of great tips, and there's been some absolute nuggets in this episode so far. But Stephen is now about to share with us in detail those lures that he would take to target yellowbelly and how he'd go about fishing them. So, mate, which one would be your top lure of the ones you've mentioned so far?
Definitely the Jackal TN60 would be the number one yellowbelly catching lure that I've ever used in the rivers.
Terrific. All right. And you've already given us a pretty good rundown on how you're going to fish that lure. Do you make any modifications to that at all, or you just fish it straight out the box?
The only thing I will do is occasionally change the hooks out. Sometimes the ones they come with can get bent up and buckled pretty easily. So I'll change them out to a one extra strong hook. I won't go too heavy because I'm using a fairly light rod, and the thicker and heavier the treble, the harder it is to penetrate with a light rod. So yeah, you want to make sure that you match your hook penetration ability with the rod you've got.
Absolutely. That's a big mistake that beginners often make. So, mate, the second lure was the Deception Nipper or Deception Shrimp suspending. So tell us about how you fish that one.
Yeah, so that one, it's pretty hard to come across nowadays, unfortunately, probably because most of them ended up in the snags. But I'll throw that out past the structure I'm fishing, crank it down, and then I'm trying to leave that lure for as long as I can on an ultra-slow retrieve in amongst the timber that I'm fishing. So I'm not trying to bounce that off big root balls or anything like that because it'll just get snagged. I'm trying to work it carefully around all of the smaller limbs and snags off a big snag in the river.
Okay, great. Now, folks, fishing suspending jerkbaits in this way is a little bit challenging for a lot of people because you actually need to be able to just sit there and dead stick it for 5, 10, 15, even maybe 30 seconds sometimes, not move the lure at all. So, Stephen, when you get a bite on a suspending jerkbait, explain how it all unfolds.
It unfolds very quickly with yellowbelly. Once they decide that they want to crack it, it's not like those subtle bites you'll get in the lakes where, as we said, the fish are a little bit lazy and a bit more careful about what they eat. These ones, when they decide to have a go, they will hit it really, really hard. So I'd like to think that I'm skilled enough and fast enough to actually set the hook, but the fish will do that for me. I'm just winding it in. So 1 minute you're carefully pausing the lure next to a bit of structure, and next second you are fully locked up. And yeah, these fish in the current go hard. So it's good fun.
White knuckle stuff. Now, mate, remind me again what your third lure choice was?
So third lure choice will be just a diving minnow, like a floating standard Australian lure. So I'll use either a number 2 stump jumper or a custom crafted extractor I really like. Little Orgy Peewee, which is a very, very small lure. So cutafara lures, I've got 6 or 8 that are all similar size. So all around that 6 to 8 centimetres. All dive to about 1.5 to 3 metres, and all can be worked really, really slowly.
So when would you choose those over the lipless crankbait or the suspending Deception?
So if I think the fish are sitting high up, which is quite often the case in that golden hour, they'll sit right up high in active feeding mode, and I don't need to get down deep, or I don't need to be very careful and slow and patient. That's when I'll choose the floating minnow. And I'm actually looking for an aggressive feeding response with those ones rather than trying to talk a fish into it.
Right, so tell us how you retrieve them, mate. How do you work them?
So My main retrieve is a slow wind, which sounds kind of crazy, with little pulses of the rod tip. So it's just working it slowly and methodically with those little rod tip pulses that give the lure a little bit of extra action. If I do come across a snag that I hit, I'll actually give it a couple of hard jerks just to knock it into that timber really loudly. And I think that gets the fish's attention a little bit better. So I'm actually probably driving it more into the snag than the other two lure types, where I'm trying to avoid getting the snags.
Yeah, it's one of those things, we all, no one likes losing lures, but unless you're putting them in danger, you're not going to be catching fish. And there are some lures definitely, like those floating shallow swimming minnows, that probably are a little less prone to getting hooked up, and you can afford to clatter them around the timber a little bit more. What hooks do you fish on those? Do you switch your hooks out to try and make them a little bit more snag-proof?
Oh, no, not really. Most of the lure makers these days are bringing out lures with better chemically sharpened hooks.
Yep.
If they do come with bronze ones, I'll definitely swap them out for chemically sharpened hooks, especially the middle treble. I think they'd have to be over 90% of the fish are caught on the middle treble rather than the tail treble. So make sure there's something chemically sharpened on there. Brand and strength probably doesn't matter so much with the floating minnow, but yeah, definitely make sure it's got chemically sharpened written on it somewhere.
All right, mate, good stuff. Now look, we've covered this species and this fishing opportunity pretty well so far. What I'd like to finish off with is just a quick rundown on some strategies and some tips for when we're having a quiet day. So we're out on the river, conditions seem right, we've got all the right gear, we're doing all the things that Stephen Booth tells us to do, but fish just aren't playing ball, mate. So I'm going to get you to give us a few tips for that. But before we do that, let's have a quick chat about your employer and some of the things that are going on at Wilson's at the moment. You've always got some exciting stuff going on. So what's happening there, mate?
Oh, it's been busy. We just had the AFTA trade show where we released, I think it was about 100 new items across all of our brands that we distribute and manufacture. So my world at the moment is all involved in about getting new products out to the right people, getting fish caught on them, getting photos, getting material up on the website. So we're flat out. We've got a couple of great lures, actually. One of the ones which I'm desperate to try on the Yellowbelly and the cod will be the fish trap, but our boss has designed it as a weedless fish trap, so it'll be great for those snaggy areas. It's been used on the barramundi, but no one's had a chance to use one down on the natives yet. So
I was going to say, I've been looking at that one on your website and thinking I've got to get a few of those for the barra. They'd be good on the yellows for sure.
Yeah, it has to work. I think it's a definite go. And the way the hook is positioned is perfect for the way the Yellowbelly attack a lure. So the hook comes out basically at the bottom in the middle of the lure, which is that prime target zone for the Yellowbelly when they crack a lure.
All right, mate, look, I'm going to put some links in the show notes to some of those lures that you're talking about and, of course, to Wilson's website. So, folks, be sure you go to the downloads and download the PDF because there's going to be a ton of great information there. You won't remember it all. Stephen's given us far too much to remember in one hit. So download the PDF, get all that information, get the links as well to Wilson's and to the weedless fish traps and some of their other great products. Go and check those out. And also from that show notes page, you can download the MP3 as well. So, Stephen, to take us home, mate, give us those tips that you've got stored away there. I know you've got some, mate, for those slow days when the fish are just not playing ball.
Yeah, okay. So first thing I would do would be make sure I have the 3 different varieties of lures that we talked about. I'd almost guarantee that if they're not eating a lipless crankbait, they'll either diving hard body lure, be that more suspending type hard body or a floating minnow. Sometimes they want to have a floating minnow, sometimes they want that lipless crankbait. So make sure you have them all, make sure you use them all on the one snag. The best tip is don't be afraid to go slower. If you think that this snag is too good not to have a fish, then it will certainly have a fish on it. So slow down and then slow down again. That applies for a lipless crankbait or a minnow lure. So don't ever go too fast. It's the biggest way that I get told every time I come down to fish for them. Slow down, slow down. I probably can't repeat that enough times.
Excellent stuff. Stephen, thanks very much for coming along today, mate, and sharing all your wealth of knowledge with us. It's been tremendous having you here again and really enjoyed talking to you. So thanks for that, and we'll see you out on the water sometime.
No worries, Greg. Good on you.
Don't miss a single episode of ALF. Subscribe and rate us on iTunes or jump on the doclures.com website for downloads and show notes. Till their next episode, Tidelines.